Out of everything I could have expected from Bayonetta 2 going into this, giving me more of an appreciation for Nintendo than what I already had was definitely not one of them. After the very successful release of Bayonetta 1, Platinum Games naturally got to work on a sequel for it. Despite how highly it was praised though, the game's initial publisher and IP owner Sega had no interest in making sequels for it. This meant Sega would have to find a new publisher to fund the project, and after being denied by almost everyone, it seems like Bayonetta 2 would never see the light of day. In comes Nintendo, who after partnering with Platinum for the wonderful 101, went ahead and offered to become the publisher for Bayonetta 2 while they were at it. Which means they are the reason literally any game in this series beyond the first one even exists. And I have an appreciation for Nintendo more now for this because Bayonetta 2 is an incredible sequel that improves on nearly everything the original did while also being more friendly to newcomers of the genre. Like, this game is a perfect example for everything a sequel should be, and without Nintendo, I and everyone else would never have been able to experience the greatness that is Bayonetta 2. Taking place a few months after the events of the first game, Bayonetta, her informant Enzo, and her friend and fellow witch Jean are doing some Christmas shopping when they're attacked by angels. Everything plays out like how it usually does, with Bayonetta and Jean totally wrecking house until Bayonetta's summoned demon dragon, Gamora, decides to break contract and attack Bayonetta for unknown reasons. In the process, Gamora slaps the soul right out of Jean, and per a witch's demonic contract, she's of course dragged off to Inferno. Afterwards, Bayonetta sets off to save her by climbing Fimbulventer, a mountain containing a gate to Inferno. The story of Bayonetta 2 feels a lot more personal for Bayonetta herself compared to the first games, and honestly, it's all the better for it. Previously, it was just about getting her memories back, and she was this confident, unstoppable, angel-slaying machine. Here, though, she has to save a friend's soul from Inferno, and she doesn't exactly have an infinite amount of time to do that. The game's story does a really good job at showing some of the more vulnerable and human sides to Bayonetta, both through her journey to save Jean and through her new amnesiac partner, Loki, who, for spoiler reasons, I can't comment on much, but I did really like. Honestly, the only real problem I have with the story this time around is with Luca. Don't get me wrong, I like that he's back. He's a fun guy to have around, but he does feel a bit like an afterthought here. Like, he does important things, so I can't say he could have easily been removed, but I do wish he was handled a bit better since there are points where it feels like he's just kinda here. Now, before we move on to the gameplay, I just need to take a moment so that we can all appreciate just how great this game looks. For something that is, from what I can tell, an almost one-to-one port of a Wii U game, Bayonetta 2 is one of the best-looking games on the Switch. Every area is visually gorgeous, and wow, has the spectacle been cranked up a notch. Most fights with the game's recurring boss, the Masked Lumen, turn into this epic kaiju fight, and bigger bosses are always either impressive in scale, have a beautiful arena you fight them in, or usually both, like with Gamora and Glamour. Honestly, there's not much more to say here. Platinum did just as good a job with Bayonetta 2's presentation as they did the gameplay, and let me tell you, that's a pretty high bar. Bayonetta 2, of course, plays similarly to the first one. As Bayonetta, you fight hordes of angels with a combination of punches and kicks from the weapons on your hands and feet, as well as with the returning Wicked Weaves and, of course, Witch Time. All the while, you're exploring each chapter for upgrades, like Broken Witch Hearts for health, Moon Pearls for magic, as well as trying to find the game's many hidden fights, or verses as they're called. Bayonetta 2, being the wonderful sequel it is, does improve on most of these things, and many more aspects of the previous games in some way though. First off, my two biggest problems with the previous game are totally fixed here. The QTEs are completely absent this time, so no more moments of surprise instant death. And the button mashing sections of the game are way easier to complete as well, so no more hand cramps for me. Bayonetta 2 also has better gimmick chapters, so to speak. The first game's chapters, Route 666 and Isla del Sol, are pretty infamous for their gameplay styles and, more importantly, for how their length makes them overstay their welcome. Bayonetta 2 has 3 gimmick chapters, but all of them are actually good and, unlike Isla del Sol, are actually fun to control. We have a better, hell-horseier version of Route 666, as well as a better, less vomit-inducing version of Isla del Sol. In a surprising move for me, we also have one that has you controlling an Umbran mech suit that canonically runs on the magic in a witch's hair, which I suppose means it's, ironically enough, eco-friendly. For real though, this chapter was actually really cool. For as weird as this is to say, being able to punch out giant angels in a mech suit was very satisfying, and it's unironically one of my favorite chapters in the game. Actually, on a related note, I gotta say, I liked Bayonetta 2's chapters more than the first game's overall. Aside from everything I've mentioned before, the enemy variety is even better here than in the first game, thanks to the addition of the new demon enemies. is. I also liked this game's version of Bayonetta 1's Alfheim portals with Muspelheim a lot more, partly because of their lovely blue aesthetic, but more so because they're much easier to find. You'll be able to track down most of them no problem, and they're not as hard to beat or get a good rank on either. And on a related note, I like how much more casual friendly this one is. While I think Bayonetta 1 is a masterpiece of an action game, it was clearly built for fans of the genre in mind. It can be pretty difficult for someone who's new to games like this, or whose skills are even remotely as bad as mine. And that's just getting through the game. None of this is even talking about getting higher rankings. Here, the difficulty isn't nearly as high. Enemies don't usually hit as hard, and compared to the first game, I only died a couple of times. The game's also way more forgiving and less strict with rankings. As an example, you aren't deducted points for using items. You can restore health and magic as much as you want, buff your attack as often as you like, and use as many invincibility lollipops as you can, all while not needing to worry about losing points. Even without using healing items though, I at worst usually only got silver rewards, and if I'm gonna be honest, this was actually really encouraging for me. In case you couldn't tell, I wasn't really good at the first game, so every time I got stone awards, I just accepted it and moved on. But here, anytime I got a lower award, I usually thought to myself, you know what, I should try this chapter again. I think I can do better than that. This led me to replaying most of the game after beating it, so I could find whatever verses I missed and improve my rank with each chapter. And I'm not gonna lie, it was all pretty satisfying. Getting gold or platinum rankings for verses, and especially chapters, just felt more achievable for someone like me. Honestly, it made me kind of want to try replaying each chapter on hard mode. On an unrelated note though, can we talk about just how great all of Bayonetta 2's weapons are? Last time I was content sticking with primarily Durga and Scarecrow Fair, but here I wanted to use nearly everything. The Twin Blades Rakshasa were one of my favorites to use because of just how fast they were. They may not hit very hard, but it sure is satisfying to rack up combos with them. The Scythe Chernabog actually became my go-to melee weapon after I beat the game. It hits harder compared to Rakshasa, and I loved how wide some of its attacks could be, and I loved pairing it with the twin chainsaws Salamandra. The combos you can rack up with these just feel really good. The hammer, Take Mikazuchi, is slow but incredibly hard-hitting. Its power and hard-feeling attacks make it really fun to use, so while I didn't use it as my go-to weapon, I did like having it on my B setup for boss fights. Undyne I personally only really enjoyed using on the legs, but I loved having them paired with Take Mikazuchi, since Undyne's hard-hitting attacks complements the hammer very well. The only weapon I didn't really use much was the bow Kafka. It's a nice enough ranged weapon, but in a game like Bayonetta, I don't really need anything ranged that isn't the basic guns, and those I really only use to keep my combo going. Credit where it's due though, it was useful for a certain Muspelheim trial that involved you not touching the ground. With one exception, it's not easy protecting these columns with a melee weapon, so Kafka was really great to have there. So for as great as Bayonetta 2 is, I do have one small problem with it, which means now it's time to talk about a new mechanic called the Umbran Climax. In the first game, your magic gauge was used primarily for torture attacks, but here, when you have one full bar of magic, you can instead choose to activate the Umbran Climax, which is basically a super mode. All of your attacks become Wicked Weaves for a short period, and honestly, it feels incredible. For about 5 seconds, you'll be easily mowing down angels and demons alike with these giant attacks, and you'll rack up a lot of combo points pretty quickly. It's at this point that the uninitiated are thinking, alright, that sounds great, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that it makes the torture attacks almost pointless to use for me. See, just like in the first game, torture attacks are special attacks Bayonetta can use for dealing massive damage to an enemy, and you can even earn a lot of combo points if you max out the gauge. When you're dealing with one stronger enemy in a verse that's susceptible to them, they can be a great way to deal with it quickly and get an incredibly fast time for that fight. If you have the Mallet of Rewards accessory equipped, you can even get bonus halos and materials for making items. Despite all those benefits though, in most situations when I'm fighting a group of enemies, I can easily rack up just as many, if not outright more points by just using the Umbran Climax. Why would I use a torture attack and do a lot of damage to just one enemy when I can rack up a ton of damage on everything around me? I don't mind at all that the Umbran Climax does admittedly kind of feel like a win button, since I do really love using it, but with how it affects torture attacks, I kinda wish it worked differently so I felt more of a reason to use both instead of almost entirely just one of them. So I said last time that my favorite game from Platinum was Astral Chain, and I gotta say, with a little more time to think about it, Bayonetta 2 will probably end up joining it, because honestly, it's just as good for me. Like, I can't stress enough just how glad I am that Nintendo stepped up and decided to help publish this series going forward, because otherwise I wouldn't have gotten to play what might be tied with Astral Chain for my favorite action game. The story was a nice improvement over the original, and I like how they showed off more sides to Bayonetta's character beyond her bulletproof confidence. Its presentation is gorgeous, and it refines almost everything the original did, with all of its problems being pretty much gone. The gameplay is just as good, and depending on who you ask, potentially even better compared to the first. And honestly, this does make me a bit nervous about Bayonetta 3. I don't know any specifics, but while people agree the game is good, from what little I can tell, it seems like there are things about it that have people a bit split. Don't get me wrong, I'm pretty confident I'll still have a good time since I've liked everything up to this point, but after how good Bayonetta 2 was, I'd hate to potentially end this marathon off on a sour note. Until then though, thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, consider supporting me on Patreon or by becoming a member of the channel, and I hope you all have a nice day.